A ruthless mafia boss who lost his wife 18 months ago tries to hold his broken world together over a quiet lunch by the Malibu shore with his 4-year-old daughter. "Daddy, that woman across the street looks just like Mommy," the little girl whispers, her ice cream dripping forgotten down her hand. He doesn't believe her at first because his daughter sees her dead mother everywhere. But when he crosses the street and gets close enough to see the stranger's face, his blood runs cold and his hands start to shake. She isn't his wife. She's someone far more dangerous to the walls he's built around his heart. Watch until the very end to find out who this mysterious woman really is, and why his late wife secretly planned for this exact moment years before she died. If you're hooked, smash that like button and share this story with someone who needs it. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Drop your city in the comments. We love knowing where our listeners are. But here's what he doesn't know yet. Someone else is watching her too, and they'll kill to get her back. Carlo stood less than 2 steps away from the woman and felt as if the ground beneath his feet were tilting. Seen up close, she didn't resemble Bianca in the way he had feared. Not a replica, not a ghost returned, but in the way 2 sisters might share a few gifts of nature and then carry them in different directions. The delicate line of her chin, the slight upward tilt at the outer corners of her eyes, the way she held her shoulders straight even though her body was so thin that her collarbones pressed sharply beneath a frayed jacket. Yet where Bianca had always radiated a warmth that drew people in, this woman gave off something entirely opposite, an instinctive wariness, a gaze like a wild animal wounded too many times to trust any hand offered. Carlo's charcoal gray suit, custom tailored at a shop in Milan, the Patek Philippe on his wrist, the leather shoes polished without a single speck of dust. All of it faced worn sneakers rubbed down to the sole, faded jeans torn not by fashion but by years of wear, and an old military jacket that someone must have dropped into a charity bin. The contrast was so extreme it felt absurd, like 2 worlds that were never meant to meet colliding on a corner of Malibu Street at dusk. Carlo noticed the scar on her wrist, a long line running from the base of her palm nearly to her elbow, not self-inflicted but defensive, the kind left when someone raises an arm to block a blade. He saw the faint bruise on her left cheekbone, already turning yellow-green, the kind that had to be at least 2 weeks old and once had been severe. The instincts of a man who had lived his entire life amid violence told him immediately that this woman wasn't merely down on her luck. She had been held captive, beaten, and somehow had managed to escape. She stepped back when he moved closer, her left foot angling slightly as if ready to run, shoulders drawing inward in defense, every signal of a body accustomed to sudden attack. Then the name left his mouth before his mind had time to confirm it. Celeste. The woman froze. Her eyes widened, fear wrestling with a faint spark of recognition. She looked at him, at the suit, at the 2 bodyguards standing several dozen meters away in the parking lot, then back at his face. "Carlo Ferretti," she said, her voice rough as if she hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Yet beneath the rasp lay an elegance that no amount of time on the streets could erase. "You know me," she added, not a question but a statement. "I was Bianca's roommate at Stanford for nearly 3 years, until I had to leave during our junior year to care for my mother." And when she spoke Bianca's name, her voice changed, softened, as if that name were the only thing from her past she still allowed herself to keep. Carlo's memory spun backward. Bianca had mentioned her during their early years together, always with a special tenderness. "The best roommate I ever had, the smartest person I've ever met." And then Celeste had vanished, and Bianca spoke of her less and less, not because she'd forgotten, but because it hurt, because she couldn't find her anywhere. While Carlo stood on the sidewalk across from the restaurant, his thoughts reeling, inside, beyond the large glass windows overlooking the sea, Helen Whitfield had just walked in. She'd come to see her granddaughter without warning. Silver hair neatly pinned, a cream cashmere coat, the straight-backed posture of a Boston lady who never allowed herself to collapse even though her daughter had been gone for 18 months. She noticed Gemma first, the child kneeling on a chair, with her face pressed to the glass, staring outside. Then she followed her granddaughter's gaze and saw Carlo talking to a ragged woman across the street. Helen stopped short. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the scene, and when she recognized the woman's features, her expression shifted several times within a few seconds, from confusion to recognition to something close to fear. She knew that woman. She remembered her, and the first question that exploded in her mind wasn't pity but suspicion. Why was she here, in this exact place, at this exact moment, right where Carlo brought Gemma every week, too coincidental to be random. Helen placed her hand on Gemma's shoulder. "Grandma," Gemma said without taking her eyes from the glass. "Dad's talking to a woman who looks like Mom. She's got eyes just like Mom's." Helen's hand tightened around her granddaughter's shoulder without her realizing it, and she stared outside with the gaze of a woman who had lost her only child and would never allow anyone to threaten what little remained. Carlo gestured briefly toward the restaurant and said, "Go inside. You need to eat something." Celeste hesitated, her defensive instincts urging her to step back, to vanish into the crowd the way she had for the past 6 months on the streets of Los Angeles. But there was something in Carlo's voice that wasn't a command, and wasn't pity either. It was closer to acknowledgement, as if he were saying, "I see you, and I'm not turning away." She followed him across the street, each step uncertain, her shoulders still drawn inward as if she were trying to make herself as small as possible. When they pushed open the restaurant door, Franco Tessari was the first to react. The 45-year-old man with shoulders like a steel cabinet stood beside Gemma's table, and the moment he saw Carlo leading a ragged stranger inside, his right hand slid inside his suit jacket with a motion so natural that anyone who didn't know better would have thought he was simply adjusting his clothes. Franco's eyes swept over Celeste from head to toe in less than 2 seconds, assessing the threat with the instincts of a man who'd served as underboss for 15 years. Carlo gave a slight shake of his head, a gesture so small only Franco caught it, and the man slowly withdrew his hand from his jacket but didn't take his eyes off Celeste. Gemma broke the tension. She slipped down from her chair and ran toward her father, but her blue eyes weren't on Carlo. They were fixed on the woman beside him. She stopped about a step away from Celeste, tilted her head up, and said in the clear, unguarded voice of a child, "Her eyes look like my mom's, just like hers. My mom had sad eyes like that when she was sick." Celeste went completely still. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Then the tears fell, not in sobs but in the quiet way of someone who'd been dry for so long and was suddenly pierced by a simple sentence from a 4-year-old that cracked the last hard shell. Tears slid silently down her angular cheeks and dropped onto the restaurant floor, and Celeste didn't lift a hand to wipe them away. Perhaps she didn't even realize she was crying. Carlo pulled out a chair for her, ordered water and food, his voice brief and accustomed to giving commands but not harsh. Celeste sat down, and the first thing she did was choose the chair facing the entrance. Carlo noticed immediately. It wasn't a preference. It was a survival instinct. She needed to see who came in. She needed to know the exits. She needed to be sure no one could approach from behind without her knowing. When the server passed behind Celeste to set the glass of water on the table, she flinched violently, shoulders tightening, fingers gripping the table edge, the reaction happening in less than a fraction of a second before she caught herself and loosened her hold. But Carlo had seen it all. He'd seen that kind of startle before, in people who'd witnessed too much violence, in soldiers back from the battlefield, in those who'd lived so long in fear that their bodies never truly left combat mode. The glass trembled in Celeste's hands when she lifted it to drink. She had to hold it with both hands, and Carlo clearly saw her thin fingers, nails cut down close, the calluses on her palms of someone who'd slept outdoors and braced herself against concrete. She drained the water like someone who hadn't had clean water in days, then set the glass down and began to speak. Her voice was low and even, as if she'd rehearsed this story in her head many times but had never actually said it aloud. Her mother was diagnosed with systemic lupus erythematosus during her 3rd year of medical school at Stanford, she said. At the same time, her mother's insurance refused to cover most of the treatment costs, claiming it was a pre-existing condition. She took a leave of absence to care for her mother, thinking it would be just 1 semester. Then 1 semester became a year became 2. Her savings ran out. She sold her car, sold her belongings, moved her mother from a small apartment to cheaper rooms, then cheaper still. When her mother died after 3 years of fighting, Celeste was 25, penniless, carrying nearly $200,000 in medical debt, with no degree, no job, and no one left in the world. Then she stopped. "I fell into a bad situation after that," she said, and the way she spoke those words, light and flat like a frozen surface, told Carlo that beneath it lay an abyss she didn't intend to let anyone see. She didn't name any names. She didn't mention who'd caused the scars on her wrist, didn't explain the bruise on her cheekbone, didn't say who'd made her flinch whenever someone walked behind her. She only said, "I got out 6 months ago, and I've been on the streets since then." Carlo listened in silence, didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. 37 years in the underworld had taught him to read people not by what they said, but by what they hid. The way Celeste avoided speaking about the time between her mother's death and her escape. The way she used the word got out instead of left. The way she unconsciously rubbed the scar on her wrist whenever the silence stretched too long. All of it told him a story clearer than any confession. Someone had locked her up. Someone had beaten her. Someone had controlled her so completely that when she escaped, she no longer remembered how to live like a normal person. And someone, Carlo knew for certain as he watched Celeste flick quick glances toward the door every few minutes, was still out there. Carlo waited until Celeste finished eating, then stood up and said in a tone that didn't allow refusal, "You're coming with me." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an invitation. It was a decision he'd already made the moment he saw the defensive scar on her wrist. Franco was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against the gleaming black Escalade, and when he saw Carlo walking out with Celeste and Gemma trotting along beside them, the underboss moved quickly to intercept Carlo 3 steps from the car. He pulled Carlo aside, turning his back to Celeste, and spoke in a low voice in Italian. "Boss, we don't know who she is, where she came from, or what she wants. You can't bring a stranger into the house where your daughter sleeps every night." Carlo met Franco's gaze, the cold eyes of a man who'd ordered deaths without blinking, and answered in Italian as well. "She's Bianca's friend. That's all I need to know. But if you need more than that, call the investigation team. I want everything on her by tomorrow morning, from her birth certificate to the last time she used a credit card." Franco wanted to argue, but one look at Carlo's eyes told him the discussion was over. 15 years as underboss had taught him, there were moments when Giancarlo Ferretti listened, and moments when he'd already decided, and this was the latter. He nodded, pulled out his phone, and started making calls before the car even left the lot. Helen stood at the restaurant entrance watching the Escalade roll away, her lips pressed into a thin line, saying nothing, but her eyes said everything. The car climbed the winding roads of the Malibu hills, past fences draped in vivid purple bougainvillea and iron gates guarding multi-million-dollar estates, then stopped before a wrought iron gate, nearly 10 feet tall, with security cameras mounted on both pillars. The gate opened automatically, and the car glided onto the stone driveway leading up the hill. The Ferretti estate appeared like a fortress disguised as paradise. A 3-story Mediterranean-style villa, with warm white stucco walls, red terracotta roof tiles, and arched windows overlooking the Pacific stretched below like a deep blue ribbon. The rose garden Bianca had planted with her own hands during the years she lived here ran along the southern slope. Hundreds of bushes in every shade, from dark crimson velvet roses to pure white blooms, still tended daily by the gardening staff under Carlo's strict orders. Not a single wilted petal allowed to touch the ground. The infinity pool on the lower level melted into the horizon, its clear water reflecting the evening sky as it turned soft orange-pink. But beneath that beauty lay something entirely different. Security cameras tucked into every corner the untrained eye would miss, motion sensors lining the perimeter fence, 2 guards patrolling the outdoor grounds on 12-hour shifts, and a central security room in the basement with surveillance screens covering an entire wall. This was the home of a boss, and every beautiful rose grew from ground protected by guns. Celeste stepped out of the car and stood frozen, staring at the house, her eyes wide in the way of someone who'd slept under bridges for too long and forgotten what a ceiling looked like. She didn't have time to stand there long because Gemma had already hopped out, ran around to her, and did something Franco would later swear had never happened since Bianca died. The child took Celeste's hand, freely, naturally, without hesitation, small fingers closing around Celeste's calloused, scarred palm, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Come on," Gemma said, tugging her toward the front door. "I'll show you my room. I've got a bear named Biscuit, and I'll show you Mom's garden too. She planted so many roses." Carlo stood beside the car watching his daughter pull Celeste into the house, and he felt something crack inside his chest. Not pain, but a thin layer of ice fracturing at the sight of Gemma's tiny hand clasping a stranger's, something she'd refused to do with anyone for 18 months, from nannies to therapists, to even Helen, her own grandmother. Franco stood beside him in silence, then said softly in English, this time, "I'll still investigate her, but that child hasn't held anyone's hand since Bianca. You know that." Carlo didn't answer. He simply walked into the house. A housekeeper led Celeste to the guest bathroom on the 2nd floor, laid out clean towels, a new toothbrush, and a simple set of clothes someone had quickly found in storage. Celeste locked the bathroom door and for the first time in 6 months, stood before a full-length mirror. Steam from the hot shower fogged the glass, but she wiped it clear with her palm and looked at herself. Her cheekbones jutted high and sharp enough to cut paper, the result of months of hunger. Her collarbones protruded starkly, her ribs visible beneath pale skin. On her left shoulder was a long crescent-shaped scar, where a broken bottle had sliced her skin on a night she tried never to think about. 3 parallel scars crossed her back, marks of a leather belt, healed but still raised in faint pink lines against white skin. Her wrist bore the long defensive scar Carlo had seen on the street. She stood there studying the map of violence carved into her body and didn't cry. She'd cried all her tears in the restaurant when Gemma said her eyes looked like her mother's. Now she simply looked and acknowledged it, as if reading someone else's medical chart. Then she stepped into the shower and let the hot water pour over her. The first time in 6 months, she hadn't bathed in cold water from a public tap. The water washed through her tangled hair, carrying away layers of street dust, flowed over her scars, ran down the drain with months of wandering. When she stepped out, dried herself, put on clean clothes, and looked at the mirror again, something had changed. Not a miracle, and not a transformation. But beneath the gauntness and scars, her original beauty emerged like a painting, wiped clean after years of dust. Fine features, large, deep-set eyes that now held not only fear, but a glimmer of something close to hope. Skin still pale but smooth and brighter after the grime of the streets. Not like Bianca, but beautiful in her own way. The beauty of someone who'd walked through hell and was still standing. Helen arrived at the Ferretti estate at 7 o'clock in the evening, without needing an invitation because she still had a personal gate code Carlo had never revoked since Bianca died, and she came with one single purpose: to see with her own eyes the woman her son-in-law had just brought into the house where her granddaughter lived. She had changed outfits since the restaurant, and now wore a discreet but exquisitely tailored silver-gray silk dress, expensive down to every stitch. Her silver hair still swept into a flawless bun, the soft trace of Chanel perfume light yet firm enough to announce her presence before she entered the room. Dinner was served in the grand dining room, the long oak table built for 12 yet set for only 4 tonight. Carlo at the head, Gemma to his left, Celeste to his right, and Helen at the opposite end facing Carlo, the seat that had once always belonged to Bianca, and that no one had occupied since Bianca died until tonight, when Helen deliberately pulled out the chair as a quiet declaration that she now held her daughter's place at this table. Celeste came down from the upper floor in clean clothes, her hair still damp, and Helen studied her openly from head to toe without hiding that she was assessing her. The silence stretched until the food was served. Grilled salmon with asparagus and mashed potatoes. Simple, yet the kind of simple only a private chef for a wealthy family could deliver, and when Celeste lifted her fork, Helen began. She didn't circle and she didn't soften her tone, her voice calm as if discussing the weather, yet every question cut sharp as a surgical blade. "Celeste, when was the last time you contacted Bianca?" Celeste set her fork down, her left hand slipping beneath the table to grip the white linen napkin, but her voice remained steady. "When I was 22, I called Bianca for the last time before changing my phone number, because I moved closer to the hospital for my mother. After that, everything revolved around caring for her, and I lost touch with everyone, not just Bianca." Helen didn't let her breathe. "Then why did you appear in Malibu, at the exact restaurant Carlo takes Gemma to every week? You can understand why I find that hard to believe." Celeste met Helen's eyes without blinking. "I didn't know Carlo brought Gemma there. I didn't even know Bianca had died until Carlo told me this afternoon. I wandered to Malibu Beach, because Bianca once told me in college that Malibu was the most beautiful place in the world, and if there was one last place to stand, that was it. I had nowhere else to go, so I went to the place the only friend I ever had said was beautiful." The answer hung in the dining room, heavy and sorrowful enough that even Helen lost momentum for a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Do you know what Carlo does for a living?" Celeste glanced at Carlo, who sat in silence without intervening, neither helping her nor stopping Helen, his eyes observing the exchange the way he observed everything, cold and precise. "I know he isn't just a businessman," Celeste said plainly. "Bianca never explained it outright, but I was smart enough to understand that my roommate wasn't dating an ordinary man when bodyguards drove her all the way to the dorm entrance." Helen tilted her head slightly. That answer wasn't what she had expected. It was more direct, more intelligent, and lacked the fear she wanted to see in a con artist being exposed. She was about to continue when Gemma cut in, her clear voice slicing through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. Auntie Celeste, tell me about my mom in college. Was she happy? Did she laugh a lot? The dining room fell silent. Helen stopped questioning, her cutlery frozen midair. Carlo looked at his daughter. Celeste looked at Gemma, those blue eyes watching her with open anticipation, and something inside her softened in a way no interrogation from Helen could ever reach. Your mom was very happy, Celeste began, her voice changing completely, gentler and warmer, as if memories of Bianca were the one room in her mind darkness had never touched. Your mom planted flowers on the dorm window even though it was forbidden. She secretly carried soil upstairs in her backpack and grew lavender and daisies in tiny pots lined along the sill. Every morning she watered them and talked to them as if they could hear. Gemma smiled, her clear laughter filling the oversized dining room that had felt too large for 4 people, but suddenly warmed by that sound. Then Celeste went on. Your mom sang terribly, legendary levels of terrible. She sang every song wrong from pop hits to the national anthem, and never felt embarrassed. She just sang louder whenever I told her she was off. And the whole dorm hated the songs but loved your mom, because no one could hate someone who sang that badly and was that happy. Gemma laughed even harder. My mom sings to me too. She always sings it wrong, the child said proudly, as if singing off key were a special talent. And then the unexpected happened. Helen, the Boston lady hard as cooled steel, who hadn't cried in front of anyone since her daughter's funeral, lifted a hand to her mouth and tears slipped through her fingers. She cried without sound, her shoulders trembling, because Celeste had brought Bianca back to life in this dining room in a way no one else ever could. Not Bianca the mother, not Bianca the wife, not Bianca the perfect dutiful daughter Helen remembered, but Bianca, the 18-year-old who secretly planted flowers and sang every song wrong, the Bianca only a college roommate knew, Bianca before cancer, before marriage, before everything, Bianca in her purest and brightest form. Carlo sat at the head of the table, his hand gripping his glass of red wine so tightly the stem trembled. His eyes lowered to the tabletop, jaw clenched, not crying, but the way he couldn't look up showed he was using every ounce of strength to hold himself together. Gemma watched her grandmother cry, watched her father fall silent, then looked at Celeste and said in the softest voice, "Tell more. I want to hear my mom laugh." Dinner ended close to 10 o'clock. Helen left in silence. She held Gemma longer than usual, but said nothing to Celeste and nothing to Carlo. Her black Mercedes slid through the iron gate and vanished into the Malibu night. And Carlo knew that silence didn't mean peace, but that she was reorganizing her thoughts, weighing things, deciding whether to treat Celeste as a threat or as something else. Gemma fell asleep almost immediately after Helen left, slumping on the sofa in the middle of another story about her mother that she'd asked Celeste to continue, and Carlo carried her upstairs, tucked her in, kissed her forehead, then stood watching her sleep for a long time, before closing the door and heading down to the basement, where Franco was waiting. The central security room sat deep underground without windows, cold white fluorescent light washing over 12 surveillance screens, and a stainless steel desk where Franco had already spread out a file about 20 pages thick. That was fast, Carlo said as he pulled out a chair. Franco shrugged and said he knew people at the police department. Carlo knew that already. Carlo opened the file and began to read. Celeste Marie Avery, born in Portland, Oregon, 28 years old. Mother Diana Avery, deceased 3 years earlier from complications of systemic lupus erythematosus. Father unnamed on the birth certificate. Full scholarship in the pre-med program at Stanford. Grade point average 3.92 during the first 2 years. Left school in the 3rd year for family reasons, and never returned. Up to that point, everything matched what Celeste had told him, and Carlo began flipping pages faster, searching for the part she hadn't told, the 2.5-year gap between her mother's death and her appearance on the streets of Malibu. And he found it. Page 14. A copy of a San Bernardino County police report from 14 months earlier. A 911 call from a prepaid phone. The caller female identifying herself as Celeste Avery, reporting domestic violence. The involved party listed as Trent Michael Holloway, 32 years old, address in Riverside. Police responded, but the caller had vanished. The victim couldn't be located. The case closed for lack of a cooperating witness. Carlo read the name Trent Holloway twice, then looked up at Franco. His eyes completely changed. No trace of the reflective fatigue from dinner, only the hard, cold gaze of a man who'd built an empire in blood and never forgot a name. Trent Holloway, he said slowly. That's the Trent tied to the fentanyl pipeline in the Inland Empire we've been tracking. Franco nodded and confirmed it was the same man, a subordinate of Ricky Salazar, distributing product from San Bernardino to Riverside. They were gathering evidence to hand the Salazar operation to the feds. Trent was a small link, but he knew a lot. Carlo closed the file, the motion gentle, but his hands clenched on the steel tabletop, and Franco saw Carlo's knuckles turn white, a sign the underboss had learned to read over 15 years, the sign that Giancarlo Ferretti was burning with the most dangerous kind of anger. Not explosive rage, but cold fury, the kind that ended with someone disappearing from the earth. "Find him," Carlo said, his voice low and even like water before a storm. "I want to know where he is, who he runs with, where he sleeps, where he eats. I want to know how many times he breathes in a day." Franco nodded, then asked if she knew. Carlo stood, pushed in his chair, didn't look at Franco. "She doesn't need to know. Not yet. I don't want her more afraid than she already is. She's been afraid enough." Franco leaned back and added one thing he knew Carlo needed to hear, even if he didn't want to. "Boss, if Trent knows she's here, and sooner or later he will, because drug crews always have eyes everywhere, he'll come, and he won't come alone. Salazar doesn't let any link weaken, and if she knows too much about the pipeline, they'll want her silent permanently." Carlo stopped at the security room door with his back to Franco and stayed silent for a long moment. Then he said, his voice stripped of emotion, but each word heavy as stone. "Good, let them come." He went up the stairs, passed through the dark living room, past Gemma's room where she slept peacefully, past Celeste's room where the light was already out, and stopped before the last door at the end of the second-floor hallway, Bianca's room. He didn't open it. He'd never opened that door at night because nighttime was when Bianca's absence became unbearable. But tonight, he rested his hand on the wood and stood there. He didn't know how long he stayed, maybe 5 minutes, maybe half an hour. But finally, he spoke in a whisper meant only for someone no longer there. "You sent her to me, didn't you, Bianca? You knew all of this ahead of time. You always did." No one answered. But the night sea breeze drifted through the window at the end of the hall, carrying the scent of roses from the garden below. The fragrance Carlo had forbidden the gardeners to change because it was Bianca's scent, and in that moment he closed his eyes, breathed it in, and almost believed his wife had just walked past him. Carlo left the estate before dawn the next morning, Franco driving him down to downtown Los Angeles for a meeting with the captains that couldn't be postponed, leaving Celeste and Gemma in the house with 2 guards on watch and the household staff. Helen arrived at 9 o'clock, earlier than she'd ever visited her granddaughter since Bianca died, and she came not for Gemma, but because she'd waited for the moment Carlo was gone. Celeste was sitting on the back terrace overlooking the rose garden when she heard the sound of heels on stone behind her. She turned and saw Helen standing there, back straight, chin slightly lifted, the bright morning sun behind her turning her into a sharp, dark silhouette as if cut with scissors. "Sit down," Helen said, her voice gentle in a dangerous way, the kind of gentleness used by someone who'd already decided she wouldn't yield on anything in this conversation. Celeste sat in the chair opposite her, spine just as straight, and waited. Helen didn't circle the point. "I thought all night, and I'll be direct, because I don't have the time or the patience for politeness. I don't trust you, Celeste. I don't trust the coincidence that you appeared exactly where my son-in-law lunches every week. I don't trust that a Stanford-educated woman as intelligent as you would accidentally wander to Malibu of all places. And I will never allow anyone, to exploit Gemma's grief or Carlo's loneliness for personal gain." Each sentence fell into the space between them like a stone dropped into still water, and Celeste listened without interrupting, without reacting, her face calm in the way only someone who'd heard far crueler words 100 times over could manage. Helen went on, "My daughter is gone. I can't protect her anymore, but I will protect my granddaughter at any cost, and if you have any intentions at all, I suggest you leave now before I'm forced to use other methods." When Helen stopped, silence stretched between the 2 women on the terrace, overlooking the rose garden of the dead. Celeste didn't lower her head, didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't explain anything beyond what she'd already said at dinner. She looked straight into Helen's eyes, straight into the pain Helen was using as a weapon, and spoke in a voice neither raised nor lowered, calm to the point of near cruelty in its honesty. "Mrs. Whitfield, I understand why you don't trust me. If I were in your place, I wouldn't either. But I won't apologize for being here, and I won't explain myself again. I've told the truth, And the truth doesn't change because the listener doesn't want to believe it. She paused for a beat, then continued. The only thing I want you to know is that Bianca wasn't just my roommate. She was the only person in this world who ever made me believe I deserved to live. When my mother was sick and I wanted to give up, wanted to stop breathing, Bianca called me every night and told me I mattered, that I had value, that the world needed me to stay, and I stayed because of her. I didn't come here for Carlo's money or for this house. I came to Malibu because it's the last place that still holds the trace of the only person who ever gave me a reason to live. Then Celeste stood up, didn't wait for Helen's response, didn't look back, and walked into the house. Helen sat alone on the terrace, hands resting on her lap, fingers trembling slightly, eyes fixed on the rose garden her daughter had planted. And for the first time since the conversation began, the steel within her cracked even though she wouldn't allow it to break. Celeste went upstairs, entered the room, closed the door, and began folding the few clothes the housekeeper had given her into the plastic bag she'd carried from the streets. She would leave. She was used to leaving. She didn't belong here, and Helen was right. She had no right to step into these people's lives. She just zipped the bag closed when the door opened, and Gemma stood in the doorway, blue eyes wide, looking at the bag in Celeste's hand, and understanding instantly in the way children understand everything, through instinct rather than logic. You're going. Her voice trembled. Celeste knelt to Gemma's eye level. I have to go, Gemma. I can't stay here forever. Gemma didn't speak. She threw herself into Celeste and wrapped her small arms tightly around Celeste's neck, holding on so hard that Celeste felt the child's frantic heartbeat through her own gaunt chest. Then she cried. Not the tantrum of a 4-year-old, but the choking sobs of a child who'd already lost her mother and was terrified of losing one more person. A wordless cry that said more clearly than any language, don't go. Please don't go. I can't survive another disappearance. Celeste held Gemma, the plastic bag falling to the floor, and she didn't cry, but her eyes squeezed shut with all her strength, as if she were using every ounce of will not to collapse. She couldn't leave. She knew she couldn't. That night, after dinner, Celeste put Gemma to bed. The child clung to her hand and wouldn't let go, and Celeste had no storybooks and no toys, so she did the only thing she could. She pulled the curtain aside to let the night sky pour in. Malibu was clear tonight, stars scattered across the black sky far from the city lights. Gemma, she said softly, do you know where your mom is now? Gemma shook her head, eyes still wet. Your mom is a star, Celeste said, pointing to the sky through the window. And every night before you sleep, you can send her a message. You close your eyes, think very clearly about what you want to tell her, then blow gently toward the sky, and the wind will carry your message to her. Gemma's eyes widened, starlight reflected in her wet blue eyes. Really? Will she get it? Really? Celeste nodded. She gets every message. Gemma closed her eyes immediately, lips pressed together in concentration, then blew softly toward the window with all the seriousness a 4-year-old could summon. Done. She opened her eyes and smiled, her first smile before sleep in 18 months. I told Mom I have you now, she whispered. I told her not to worry anymore. Celeste swallowed, her throat tight. Then Gemma looked up at her and said, Can I call you Miss Star? Because you let me talk to Mom through the star. You can call me anything you want, Gemma, Celeste whispered. The child lay back on the pillow, still holding Celeste's hand, and for the first time in 18 months, Gemma Ferretti closed her eyes and fell asleep without crying. Outside the bedroom, Carlo stood in the darkness of the hallway, his back against the wall, eyes closed, hands clenched into fists, not from anger but from something larger than anger, larger than grief, something he had no name for. He'd been standing there since Celeste began telling the story of the star. He'd heard everything, and he'd heard his daughter laugh before sleep, a sound he'd believed he would never hear again. That night after Gemma fell asleep, Carlo didn't return to his own room but went straight to Bianca's. He had avoided this room for 18 months, only standing outside the door, only resting his hand against the wood, only whispering to someone no longer inside. But tonight something was different. Gemma's laughter before sleep was still echoing in his head, and it gave him what nothing in the past 18 months had given him, enough courage to turn the handle. The door opened into darkness, and the scent hit him immediately. Not the roses from the garden, but Bianca's perfume, Jo Malone, peony, and blush suede, the bottle still standing on the vanity where his wife had left it. The fragrance faded after 18 months, but still strong enough to make Carlo's knees threaten to buckle. He switched on the bedside lamp, and the soft yellow light revealed a room preserved in every detail, exactly as it had been the last day Bianca left for the hospital. The bed was still made with white sheets, 2 pillows still in place, though only one had been used and then no one again. The silk robe hung behind the bathroom door, the fleece slippers by the bed, the half-read book with its corner folded at page 143. Carlo hadn't come to reminisce. He came for a specific reason. Bianca had kept all important documents in the vanity: the will, insurance papers, Gemma's birth certificate, and the family lawyer had asked him to find a copy of a property deed needed for a legitimate transfer. He opened the main drawer and found the deed. But when he pulled it fully open, he heard a faint click behind it. He removed the drawer completely and discovered a hidden space. Not truly hidden, but a gap between the back of the drawer and the rear panel of the vanity, where Bianca had concealed a small mother-of-pearl inlaid wooden box Carlo had never seen. He placed the box on Bianca's bed and opened it. Inside were 6 envelopes, each handwritten in Bianca's familiar script, rounded letters slanting slightly to the right, a handwriting he recognized instantly from hundreds of birthday cards, thousands of notes stuck to the refrigerator, and a 12-page love letter she had written the night before their wedding. The first envelope read, "For Carlo, when you are ready." The second, "For Gemma, on her 5th birthday." The third, "For Mom." The fourth, "For Franco, the brother I never had." The 5th made Carlo's hand stop completely, "For Celeste, when she finds her way back." Carlo read that line twice, 3 times, his fingers tracing the ink, and a chill ran down his spine. Bianca had known. Bianca had believed Celeste would return. Or at least she had hoped, prayed, believed strongly enough to write a letter in advance and hide it in this secret box waiting for that day. The 6th envelope had no name, only the word, "Finally." Carlo sat on the edge of the bed with the box on his knees, and with hands that had once crushed a man's throat, broken a traitor's fingers, signed death orders with a nod. He opened the first envelope, the one bearing his name, gently and carefully, almost trembling. The letter was 4 pages long. Bianca had written it 3 weeks before she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, meaning she wrote it while she was still healthy, before she knew she would die, written by instinct or intuition, or by a love that sometimes knows things reason can't explain. She wrote that she had hired a private investigator to look for Celeste for 2 years before that, spending nearly $50,000 from a private account Carlo didn't know about. But Celeste had seemed to vanish from every system. No address, no phone, no bank accounts, no trace since her mother died. The investigator had given up. Bianca wrote that she never stopped searching because Celeste wasn't just a friend. She was the best part of the best years of my life. Then she wrote about Carlo, about the darkness she knew he carried, the darkness of the underworld, of violence, of decisions he never spoke of, but she always knew through bruised knuckles, and the empty look in his eyes when he came home late. Carlo, if you're reading this, it means life has turned in a way that requires you to read it. And I want you to know that Celeste is the person I trust most in this world besides you. She has a heart big enough to love Gemma, and strong enough to endure your world. Don't let your darkness swallow the light Celeste brings. Carlo, I beg you, because she has walked through her own hell too. She will understand you in a way no one else ever could. Not because she accepts darkness, but because she knows what darkness looks like from the inside. Carlo finished the letter and sat motionless on his wife's bed. He didn't fold it. He held it in his hands. 4 thin pages carrying the voice of someone gone but still arranging the lives of those left behind. The room was utterly silent, broken only by the distant sound of the sea far below the hill and the soft rustle of curtains in the breeze. Then Giancarlo Ferretti, the Mafia boss who controlled an underworld empire from New York to Miami, the man enemies called Il Diavolo and allies called Boss, the man who had never allowed anyone to see him weak, bowed his head over his wife's letter and cried. He cried without sound, shoulders shaking, tears falling onto Bianca's rounded, right, slanted handwriting and blurring the ink at the corner of the final page. He cried for the first time since the funeral, the first time since the day he stood beside the white oak coffin and swore he would never cry again because tears wouldn't bring Bianca back. But tonight, in his wife's room, with his wife's letter, he cried not from loss but from the realization that Bianca was still loving him from the other side, still worrying about him, still trying to save him from himself, even when she was no longer here to hold his hand. Carlo couldn't sleep after reading the letter. He stayed in Bianca's room until nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, then carefully folded the letter back into its envelope, placed the mother-of-pearl inlaid wooden box into the drawer of his own desk instead of returning it to its hiding place, and by the time dawn filtered through the windows of the first-floor living room where he sat drinking his third espresso, he knew exactly what he was going to say to Celeste. He didn't call her down. He waited. Celeste woke early, the habit of someone who'd lived on the streets too long for her body to remember how to sleep in, and when she came down the stairs at 6:15, hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, wearing the borrowed clothes that had been washed overnight and dried on the bathroom railing, she saw Carlo sitting alone at the breakfast table, an espresso cup in front of him, and she knew immediately he'd been waiting for her because the way he looked at her was different from yesterday. Not pity and not curiosity, but the look of a man who'd made a decision and had no intention of changing it. "Sit down," he said, and she took the chair opposite him, back straight, hands on the table, ready for anything, including being asked to leave. Carlo set his espresso down and spoke without circling the point. "You're staying." Celeste opened her mouth to object, but Carlo raised his hand. Not the gesture of command, but of someone who needed to finish speaking before being interrupted. "This isn't charity," he said. "I don't do charity. And this isn't because I pity you. I don't pity anyone. Bianca wanted you here." He didn't explain further, didn't mention the letter, didn't tell Celeste that his wife had written an envelope with her name and hidden it away waiting for this day. He only said those 4 words, "Bianca wanted it," and let the weight of Bianca's name do the rest. Then he continued, "And Gemma needs you. Last night was the first time she didn't cry before sleeping in 18 months. I've tried everything. Nannies, the best child psychologists in Los Angeles, art therapy, music therapy, nothing worked. You came for one day and she smiled before sleep. I don't know what you did, but I know I don't want to lose that." Celeste sat listening, fingers interlaced on the tabletop, and when Carlo stopped, she couldn't speak for several seconds because her throat had tightened. But then she swallowed, lifted her head, and said in a steady voice despite her reddened eyes, "I don't live off anyone. I depended on a man once in my life, and it nearly killed me. I will never put myself in that position again. If I stay, then I stay on my own feet, not on anyone's mercy." It was the first time Celeste referred to Trent, without saying his name, only a man, but the way she said "nearly killed me" in that flat, emotionless tone told Carlo she wasn't exaggerating. She meant it literally. And what flared in his chest at those words wasn't pity but respect, cold and sharp as a blade, for a woman who'd been broken and refused to stay down. Carlo nodded slowly, and for the first time in the conversation, his gaze softened for a fraction of a second before returning to neutral. "Then this is a job," he said. "Gemma needs a dedicated caregiver. You have a medical background even if unfinished. You understand children. You know how to talk to her in a way no one else does. I pay a salary. There's a clear contract. You have your own room, your privacy, and you have the right to leave whenever you want. No one keeps you here if you don't want to stay." He paused, then added, "Those are my terms. What are yours?" Celeste looked at him, and for the first time Carlo saw the corner of her mouth lift slightly. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, the trace of the woman who'd once been confident enough to earn a full scholarship to Stanford. "Professional distance," she said. "I'm Gemma's caregiver, not a guest in this house. I work, I get paid, I keep my boundaries, and if at any point I feel like a burden or that I'm here for the wrong reasons, I leave. No explanations. No one needs to agree." Carlo nodded. "Fine." He extended his hand. Celeste looked at it for a second, then placed her own in his. Her hand was small, fingers long but thin, skin roughened at the palm and fingertips from months on concrete, the defensive scar running from her wrist up her forearm visible beneath her sleeve as she reached toward him. Carlo's hand was nearly twice the size, the knuckles of his index and middle fingers slightly deformed from too many fights over 37 years, a thin scar crossing the back of his right hand he'd never explained to anyone. When their hands met, both of them flinched slightly, not from pain but from something that jumped across the point of contact between skin and skin, fast and hot like static electricity, and both felt it clearly, but neither acknowledged it. Neither held the other's gaze for more than a second. Neither said anything except the word "fine" that Carlo repeated before withdrawing his hand. Celeste drew her hand back to her lap, her fingers curling inward, as if holding on to the warmth of that brief contact, without realizing she was doing it. The morning continued. Gemma woke and ran downstairs to find Celeste before looking for her father, and Carlo watched his daughter take Celeste's hand and pull her toward the rose garden, feeling Bianca's letter still warm in the drawer of his desk, like a second heart beating in this house. At the same time, from his private room on the ground floor, he called Mitchell Keene, the Ferretti family's chief attorney, the man who handled everything from legitimate real estate contracts to matters no lawyer wanted to know too much about. Carlo gave short orders. Prepare the paperwork for a restraining order against Trent Michael Holloway. Victim Celeste Marie Avery. Use the San Bernardino County Police report as evidence. File with the Los Angeles Superior Court within 48 hours. And at the same time, contact our source at the DEA to accelerate the federal investigation into Ricky Salazar's fentanyl operation, in which Trent is a link. Mitchell asked whether he wanted to protect her through the law or other means. Carlo replied, both. The law is the shield and I'm the sword, and I want Trent Holloway to see both coming at him at the same time. He ended the call and looked out the window where Gemma was leading Celeste between Bianca's rose bushes, a tiny hand gripping a scarred one, and Carlo thought Bianca had been right, as always. Bianca was always right. 2 weeks passed, and the Ferretti estate began to breathe differently. Every morning Celeste woke at 6, made coffee for herself and an espresso for Carlo even though he never asked, then prepared Gemma's breakfast before the housekeeper even reached the kitchen. At 7:30, Gemma woke and ran straight to Celeste before looking for her father, climbing into her lap at the breakfast table and telling her what message she'd sent to Mom through the star the night before. From 8 to 11, Celeste taught Gemma, not the way a nanny read stories aloud, but the way someone with a scientific background did, turning everything into an experiment, using flowers from the garden to teach colors and counting, using seawater to explain why the ocean was salty, using sunlight through a prism to show Gemma a rainbow in the living room and making the child shriek with delight. In the afternoons they went into the rose garden. Celeste taught Gemma how to water properly and told her the names of each flower. Your mom planted this one because it's called Peace Rose and she liked peace. Your mom planted that one because it's called Double Delight, and she said life should have double joy. Celeste didn't know these things herself, but she read the labels Bianca had carefully placed at the base of every rose bush and turned them into stories. Evenings were sacred. Celeste drew the curtains, opened the window, and Gemma sent messages to her mother through the stars, and then slept. No tears. Night after night without tears. And every night Carlo stood in the hallway listening to their whispers, before returning to his room with a weight in his chest he still didn't dare name. Celeste changed day by day. Color returned to her skin. Her cheekbones were still sharp, but no longer frighteningly so because 3 full meals a day were slowly filling the hollows hunger had carved out. Her eyes grew brighter and clearer, and she began to laugh. Not polite laughter, but bursts that escaped when Gemma said something silly, short, startled laughs, as if she were hearing the sound of herself again after years, and wasn't sure it still belonged to her. Franco even began nodding to her each morning instead of ignoring her, the highest level of acceptance the underboss ever offered anyone outside the family. But the Ferretti estate wasn't only roses and star stories. On the 14th night since Celeste arrived, she woke near 2 o'clock thirsty. She went downstairs barefoot on the cold stone floor, and as she passed Carlo's study, she heard his voice through the half-closed door. It was cold, low, steady, and nothing like the man she'd seen smiling at Gemma's rainbow story in the living room hours earlier. I don't care how much he owes, and I don't care when he promised to pay, Carlo said into the phone. He took the product. He sold the product. He kept my money. That's not business. That's disrespect, and I don't allow anyone to disrespect me. Silence for a few seconds, while the person on the other end spoke. Then Carlo replied, his tone unchanged. Handle him. Clean. I don't want to hear about him again. Celeste froze outside the door, feet rooted to the stone. The glass of water she hadn't poured forgotten in her hand. Those 2 words, handle him, echoed in her head, and each repetition carried a clearer, darker meaning. She knew who Carlo was. She'd told Helen she was smart enough to understand her roommate hadn't dated an ordinary man, but knowing with your mind was one thing, and hearing with your own ears at 2 in the morning, a man ordering someone erased with the calm of ordering food, was another entirely. She backed away, silent on the stone, up the stairs, into her room, closed the door, and sat on the bed in the dark until morning without sleeping again. The next morning Celeste waited until Gemma finished breakfast. and went to play in the garden with the housekeeper. Then found Carlo in the living room. He was reading the paper, espresso on the table, morning light through the window, making him look like an ordinary businessman, handsome, tired, harmless. Celeste didn't let the light fool her. "I heard you last night," she said directly, stopping 3 steps away and not sitting down because she needed to stand to keep herself from shrinking in this conversation. Carlo lowered the paper and looked at her. Not surprised, not defensive, not explaining, just watching her with dark brown eyes without a ripple and waiting. "Handle him clean," Celeste repeated, her voice steady though her hands clenched at her sides. "What does that mean? I need you to tell me plainly." Carlo set his espresso down, leaned back, and studied her for a few seconds before answering. "It means exactly what you think it means," he said. "Not cold and not warm, just truth without sugar." Celeste drew in a sharp breath. "I'm living in the house of a killer," she said. Not a question, but a statement she needed to hear out loud. Carlo didn't blink. "You knew who I was when you agreed to stay," he said. "I didn't hide anything from you, and I won't start now. This is my world. It's brutal, and it isn't clean. But it keeps my daughter safe. It keeps this roof standing. And now it keeps you safe too, whether you want to admit that or not." Celeste stood there, feeling torn in two. One part of her, the part that had been a medical student, the part that believed in law and ethics and clear lines of right and wrong, wanted to turn and walk out the door without looking back. But another part, the part that had lived with Trent for 2.5 years, the part that knew the police had come and gone for lack of a cooperating witness while she lay bleeding on the kitchen floor, the part that knew the world wasn't black and white but gray, so dark it was nearly black. That part understood Carlo in a way she wished she didn't. She turned toward the stairs without another word, and Carlo didn't stop her. She went up to the 2nd floor, down the hallway, and stopped outside Gemma's room. The door was ajar. The housekeeper had put the child down for a nap, and Celeste saw Gemma curled on the bed clutching her biscuit bear, her face peaceful in sleep. No frown, no restless dreams, no dried tears on her cheeks like the nights before Celeste arrived that the former nanny had described. Celeste rested her hand on the doorknob and stood there a long time. Then she let go, went back to her own room, and didn't pack her things. 3 days after the confrontation about the 2 o'clock phone call, Franco walked into Carlo's office without knocking. "Trent knows she's here," he said flatly. "This morning, security spotted a black Dodge Charger parked outside the estate gate for 45 minutes. When the guard approached, the car revved and took off. The plate traced back to a rental contract under the name Trent Holloway at a Riverside car rental company." Carlo stayed silent for 10 seconds, then ordered security doubled. 2 inside the house around the clock, 2 at the gate. But Celeste had seen the car too. She was taking Gemma onto the terrace to draw with crayons when the black Charger pulled up just beyond the iron gate, and her eyes caught the plate before the guard stepped out. She recognized it instantly because Trent always rented from the same company, always chose a black Charger, plates beginning with the same 3 characters as the car he used to drive her between drop points when he didn't want her alone at home for fear she'd run. The blood drained from her face in a heartbeat, leaving her so pale that Gemma looked up and asked if she was sick. Celeste forced a smile, guided Gemma inside, handed her to the housekeeper, went upstairs, closed the door, slid down behind it and sat, hugging her knees, shaking. He'd found her. 6 months of running, sleeping under bridges, changing areas every week, and he'd still found her. The prey instinct inside her had only one command: run. That night she waited for the house to fall silent, waited for the patrol footsteps to move farther away. At 2:15 she opened her door, lifted the plastic bag with a few clothes, walked barefoot across the stone floor to make no sound, went down the back stairs to the kitchen and toward the rear door that opened to the rose garden, where a narrow path along the hillside was used by the gardeners. She didn't go to Gemma's room one last time because she knew if she saw the child sleeping she wouldn't be able to leave. She put her hand on the back door handle and pulled. Carlo stood on the other side, leaning against the frame in the dark. Black shirt, a whiskey glass a third full in his hand. Eyes fixed on her as if he'd been standing there for an hour waiting for this exact moment. He looked at the plastic bag, then up into her eyes. Not surprised. He'd known she would run. Celeste spoke fast in a whisper. "You don't understand. Trent didn't just beat me. He's tied to drugs. He has people. He won't come alone. If I stay here, I put Gemma in danger. I have to go." Carlo finished the whiskey, set the glass on the counter, then looked at her with a cold, sharp smile she'd never seen before. the smile of someone who knew exactly where he stood in the food chain. You think a low-level fentanyl dealer for Ricky Salazar in the Inland Empire is more dangerous than me. Celeste froze because Carlo knew Trent's name, knew what he sold and for whom, knew everything, and his calm was the kind only truly dangerous men possessed. Then the cold smile vanished, and Carlo's voice dropped, losing the edge of mockery and taking on something solid and heavy like the stone beneath their feet. Celeste, no one touches you while you're in this house. Not Trent, not Salazar, not anyone. I don't make empty promises. The plastic bag slipped from Celeste's hand and hit the kitchen floor, and tears spilled down her face. She cried standing there, silent, uncovered, not turning away, because she wasn't crying from sadness or fear, but because for the first time in nearly 3 years, since before Trent, before her mother died, before everything collapsed, she felt safe. Carlo didn't hold her. He didn't step forward, didn't put a hand on her shoulder, didn't add a word of comfort. He simply stood one step away, back straight and shoulders broad, and his presence wasn't words or gestures, but a wall of flesh and bone between her and everything dark outside, and Celeste stood behind that wall and cried until she had no tears left. Carlo brought Bianca's letter to Helen the next morning, not the one written for him, but the third envelope from the mother-of-pearl inlaid wooden box, the one labeled for Mother. He drove to Helen's house in Santa Monica, placed the envelope on the coffee table in the living room, said simply, "Bianca wrote to you. I found it in her room," then stood up and left because he knew Helen needed to read it alone. Helen sat staring at the envelope for 10 minutes before opening it, her fingers trembling as she lifted the flap, and the moment she pulled out the first page, she recognized her daughter's handwriting instantly. The rounded script slanted slightly to the right that she had read in letters from summer camp and in Mother's Day cards written in colored crayon. Bianca wrote that she knew her mother would be angry, knew she would doubt, knew she would want to protect Gemma by pushing everyone away because that was how she loved, fiercely and bristling like barbed wire around a garden. "But Mom," Bianca wrote, "I need you to know who Celeste is to me. My first year at Stanford, I missed home so badly I couldn't sleep. I called you every night, but there were nights I didn't dare call because I didn't want you to worry. And on those nights, Celeste sat on the bed across from me in our dark dorm room, saying nothing, just staying awake with me until I could sleep. When I wanted to quit after my second semester, because I was lonely and thought I wasn't good enough, Celeste was the one who said, 'Hey, if you go home, then who's going to grow flowers on your windowsill?' And that silly sentence kept me at Stanford, Mom. Celeste saved me. Not once, but many times. In small ways I never told you about because I knew you'd worry. Now I'm asking you for one thing. Let her save the people I love. Let her into our home. Don't close your heart. I know you're in pain and I'm sorry I'm not there anymore, but Mom, don't turn your pain into a fence. Turn it into a gate." Helen finished the letter and sat motionless on the sofa in her quiet Santa Monica home, the page resting on her lap, and she broke. Not loudly, but from the inside. The kind of breaking where 18 months of strength, 18 months of never crying in front of anyone, 18 months of holding her back straight and chin high collapsed all at once. She called Carlo 30 minutes later, her voice still shaking. "Bianca wants her here," she said, nothing more. But Carlo heard everything in those 6 words, heard a mother surrendering to her daughter's last wish. He answered, "I know." In the weeks that followed, the Ferretti estate changed in small, unspoken ways. Helen still visited but no longer questioned Celeste. She nodded to her in the mornings, sometimes sat beside her on the terrace watching Gemma play without speaking. But the silence was different now, no longer cold, just 2 women learning how to exist side by side. And between Carlo and Celeste, something else was happening, something they both felt but never named. It began one afternoon when Carlo taught Celeste how to drive inside the estate grounds, because she'd never owned a car, and he said she needed to know in case of emergencies. She sat behind the wheel of the Range Rover, hands gripping 10 and 2 exactly as he instructed, and when she forgot to signal, Carlo placed his hand over hers on the steering wheel to guide her. They both felt the heat where skin met skin, and Carlo pulled his hand back faster than necessary, eyes fixed straight ahead through the windshield, as if nothing had happened. It continued one night, when Carlo came home close to 1 in the morning after a meeting he never described, and Celeste was getting water in the kitchen when she saw him at the bar washing his hands under the faucet, the knuckles of his right hand bleeding, the skin torn nearly to the bone. She didn't ask why, didn't look at him with judgment. She simply took the first aid kit from the cabinet, sat on the stool beside him, took his bleeding hand and laid it in her palm, then cleaned the wound with alcohol and wrapped it in white gauze. Her hands were professional and gentle, the hands of someone who had studied medicine. And Carlo sat still watching her work, watching her head bent over his hand, watching her slender fingers wind the gauze around his knuckles. And he realized this was the first time since Bianca that someone had cared for him not out of fear but because they wanted to. And it repeated on nights when neither of them could sleep. Carlo went out to the rose garden at 2 or 3 in the morning because it was where he felt closest to Bianca. And some nights Celeste was already there, sitting on the stone bench beside the peace rose, eyes lifted to the sky. They didn't talk much. Sometimes they just sat in silence for 10 or 20 minutes before returning to their rooms. But one night, Carlo said Bianca used to believe every star was a promise, and Celeste replied, Bianca always believed in beautiful things, even when the world didn't. And after that, they sat quiet for a long time. Yet the distance between the 2 stone benches seemed shorter than before, even though neither moved closer. The pull was there, clear and dangerous like a live current beneath the ground. But neither crossed the line because Carlo still wore Bianca's wedding ring, and Celeste still didn't believe she deserved to be touched without pain. The call came at 4 in the morning, Franco on the other end, his voice stretched tight as steel. Boss. They broke into Bellezza in Santa Monica. Carlo sat up in bed, fully awake in the way only someone who had lived a lifetime in danger ever woke. No grogginess, no confusion, eyes open and ready. Bellezza was the upscale Italian restaurant the Ferretti family owned legitimately, one of the cleanest fronts in Carlo's empire. The place where politicians dined and Hollywood stars booked tables 2 weeks in advance. When Carlo arrived 40 minutes later with Franco, the restaurant's glass doors were shattered, tables overturned, and on the white wall behind the bar someone had sprayed a large message in red paint, "Give her back." No signature, none needed, because both Carlo and Franco knew exactly who it was. Security cameras showed 3 masked men, one with a wrist tattoo. Franco's intelligence team identified within an hour as a member of the Salazar pipeline. Carlo stood in the wreckage, broken glass crunching under his shoes, staring at the red words on the wall. And Franco saw something he had witnessed only a handful of times in 15 years. Carlo's jaw clenched so hard the muscle at his temple stood out. His eyes narrowed into dark slits, the air around him seeming to drop a few degrees. "This isn't just Trent looking for Celeste anymore," Franco said, pointing at the wall. "This is a provocation against the family. They damaged your property. They're telling the entire underworld someone can touch Ferretti and walk away." Carlo nodded slowly. That was exactly what he was thinking. In his world, an unanswered provocation became an invitation for more, and any boss who lost control of the message soon lost control of everything. Sitting in the car outside the restaurant, Carlo made the decision. "Shut down Trent's entire line," he said. "Not just Trent, but his whole distribution channel. Push our DEA contacts to accelerate the Salazar investigation. I want federal agents kicking in Salazar's door within 2 weeks, and I want Trent to know that everything he loses starts with the night he sprayed paint on my wall." Franco nodded, then fell silent for a moment before saying what he had been holding back for weeks. "Boss," he said slowly, "I've followed you for 15 years. I know when you're protecting territory and when you're protecting a person. This isn't about the restaurant. It isn't about family pride. You're protecting her, and you're doing it for more than Bianca." Carlo looked at him, and for a split second something flickered across his eyes, quick and fragile as light through a cracked door. Then it was gone. He neither confirmed nor denied it, only said, "Do what I told you," and ordered Franco to drive home. When he reached the estate at dawn, Carlo found Celeste in the kitchen preparing breakfast for Gemma. He asked her to sit and told her everything. The car at the gate the week before, the restaurant attack overnight, the words on the wall. He didn't soften it, didn't hide anything, because he had promised her at the back door that night he wouldn't keep the truth from her. Celeste listened and collapsed inward, not loudly but with her shoulders folding as if another stone had been added to an already overburdened back. "This is all my fault," she said hoarsely. "I brought this into your home, into Gemma's life. I told you I should leave. If I go, Trent will follow me and leave your family alone." Carlo stepped in front of her and did something he hadn't done since that night by the back door. He placed both hands on her shoulders, deliberately and firmly, his large hands gripping her slender frame and holding her upright as she started to fold. Celeste looked up at him with red eyes, and Carlo spoke in a voice she had never heard from him before. Not cold like when he gave orders, not gentle like that night, but something in between, something real. You didn't bring danger here, Celeste. Danger is my life. It was here before you arrived, and it'll be here after this ends. The only difference is that before I fought for money and territory and power, and this time I have a different reason. He didn't name that reason. He didn't need to. His hands were still on her shoulders, and Celeste felt the answer in the warmth seeping through his palms into her skin. Gemma ran into the kitchen then, wrapped her arms around Celeste's leg and looked up at her father. "Daddy, keep Miss Starr safe." "Okay." Carlo looked at his daughter, then at Celeste, released her shoulders, and nodded. Carlo flew to New York that afternoon for a meeting with East Coast partners he had postponed twice and could not delay again. He doubled security at the estate before leaving and told Franco to stay behind to watch the house, but neither he nor Franco anticipated that Trent would be reckless enough to strike on the single night Carlo was away, and later Carlo would question endlessly whether Trent had an insider tracking his schedule or whether it was simply a brutal coincidence. It happened at 11:20 that night. Celeste had just put Gemma to bed, and the child had just finished sending her message to her mother through the star when glass shattered on the first floor. A sharp, explosive crack slicing through the hilltop silence, followed immediately by gunfire. Celeste reacted, before her mind caught up. She snatched Gemma from the bed as the child screamed in terror, and ran down the second-floor hallway toward the safe room Carlo had shown her in the first week, the steel door hidden behind the wardrobe in the master bedroom, the 6-digit code Carlo had made her memorize. Her hands shook so badly she entered it wrong the first time. Gunshots echoed below, mixed with shouting and crashing objects. She tried again, and the door opened. She pulled Gemma inside and slammed the steel door shut. The safe room was small, reinforced concrete. White LED lights flicked on automatically, with water, an emergency phone, and cameras showing every angle of the house. Celeste looked at the monitors and saw Franco on the first floor, taking cover behind a stone column in the living room, gun in hand, firing at 3 dark figures forcing their way in through the shattered glass doors. One guard lay motionless in the hallway. She did not know if he was alive or dead. Gemma cried, not loudly but in broken, trembling sobs, fear so deep it could not rise to a scream. The child curled into Celeste's chest, face buried against her, small hands clutching her shirt until the fingers turned white. "Miss Starr," Gemma whimpered. "Miss Starr, I'm scared. I want Daddy. I want Mommy." Celeste held her tight, back against the cold concrete wall, and did the only thing she could think of. She sang, not a song she knew, but the song Gemma had taught her during the Star Stories, the one Bianca used to sing every night before sleep, the one Gemma said her mother always sang wrong, but that she loved her wrong singing more than anyone else singing it right. Celeste sang softly, her voice shaking and off-key even more than Bianca's, but she sang the exact wrong words Gemma remembered, the familiar crooked melody, and slowly Gemma's sobs eased. The child still trembled but no longer stiffened, her face still pressed to Celeste's chest, but her grip loosened a little. On the cameras, Franco hit one attacker in the shoulder. The other 2 dragged their wounded partner away and retreated. The second guard from the outer gate rushed in to support. The gunfire thinned and then stopped. Franco took a grazing bullet to his left upper arm, blood soaking his vest sleeve, but he stayed on his feet, cleared the house, then called Carlo. In New York, Carlo was sitting in a hotel conference room. When his phone vibrated, he saw Franco's name and knew instantly something was wrong, because Franco never called at that hour unless it was critical. Franco spoke 3 sentences. "Trent's people attacked the house. I pushed them back. Celeste and Gemma are safe in the safe room." Carlo said nothing, ended the call, stood up from the meeting table in front of 5 of the most powerful men on the East Coast without explanation, walked out, and called his private pilot. 45 minutes later, he was airborne. 5 hours later, he landed at the private Van Nuys airfield. 20 minutes after that, he stepped through the doors of the estate, where the living room windows were temporarily boarded up, and the injured guard had been taken to the hospital and survived. Franco waited at the entrance, his upper arm wrapped in a blood-stained white bandage, and reported tersely, 3 men, Salazar line. Trent didn't enter the house but waited in a car on the street. They fled toward Riverside. Carlo went straight upstairs, through a hallway still faintly smelling of gunpowder, into the master bedroom, opened the wardrobe, entered the safe room code. The steel door opened, and he saw Celeste sitting on the floor holding Gemma, both trembling, Celeste's eyes red and raw but dry of tears, Gemma's eyes swollen, the child asleep in her arms yet still clutching her shirt even in sleep. Carlo dropped to his knees on the safe room floor, the knees of a Mafia boss touching cold concrete, and he wrapped both of them in his arms. He drew Celeste and Gemma into his chest. Holding them so tightly, Celeste felt his heart racing through his shirt. He said nothing for the first half-minute, only held them, and Celeste felt every wall Carlo had built around himself for 18 months collapse at once inside that embrace. Then he spoke, his voice breaking in a way she had never imagined from this man. "I'm sorry. I won't let this happen again. I promise. I promise." Gemma stirred awake in her father's arms, opened her swollen eyes and whispered hoarsely from too much crying, "Daddy? Miss Starr sang Mommy's song for me. She sang it wrong like Mommy. I wasn't scared when she sang." Carlo looked at Celeste over his daughter's head, his eyes wet, and she looked back at him, and under the cold white lead lights of the safe room at 4 a.m, amid the smell of gunpowder and tears, they both knew that whatever stood between them had crossed every boundary they had once drawn. Carlo took 3 days to find Trent Holloway, not because Trent was hard to locate, but because Carlo wanted to do it properly, to place every piece on the board before making his final move. On the first day, he called Mitchell Keene and ordered him to finalize the restraining order paperwork and file it with the Los Angeles Superior Court that very morning, while also activating their DEA contacts and handing over all the evidence the Ferretti intelligence team had gathered on Ricky Salazar's fentanyl operation, including Trent's role as a distributor in the Inland Empire. On the second day, the DEA raided 3 stash locations in San Bernardino and Riverside, arresting 7 people, seizing hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and enough fentanyl to support federal charges. Trent was not among those arrested because he had fled immediately after the night of the estate attack. But he lost everything: his supply line, his partners, his income, and Salazar's protection, because Salazar was now sitting in a federal interrogation room, unable to protect even himself. On the third day, Franco confirmed that Trent was hiding alone in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Barstow, broke and abandoned, with nothing left except an unpaid rental Dodge Charger. Carlo went with Franco and 2 others, arriving at the motel at 10 that night. What happened inside that room was known only to Carlo and Franco, and this story will not describe it in detail, except to say that when Carlo entered, Trent was sitting on the bed, his face drained of color because he knew exactly who Giancarlo Ferretti was. Every low-level dealer in California knew that name, and he knew the night he sprayed red paint on the wall of Bellezza was the night he signed his own sentence. Carlo did not shout or strike him. He did not need to. He simply stood there in a black suit, hands in his pockets, looking down at the man who had locked Celeste away for 2.5 years, who had beaten her with broken bottles, leather belts, and fists, who had buried her in darkness until she forgot who she was. Carlo gave him a choice: disappear from California within 24 hours, and go anywhere he wanted. Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Mexico. It was his decision. But if he ever set foot in California again, if he called, texted, or asked anyone to contact Celeste, if he even thought about her name, there would be no conversation next time, and he would never see the sun again. Trent looked at Carlo, at Franco standing behind him with his arm still bandaged from the night of the attack, at the 2 other men blocking the door, and finally understood what he had been too stupid or too arrogant to see before, that he was an ant standing before an elephant, that he had challenged an empire men 100 times larger than him would never dare touch, and that the fact he was still breathing that night depended entirely on the limited patience of the man in front of him. He chose to disappear. Carlo turned and walked out without looking back. On the drive home, he said nothing. Franco drove through the desert and back onto Highway 1 toward Malibu, streetlights washing over Carlo's face in the back seat, while his eyes looked inward, to a distant and dark place only he knew. They reached the estate at dawn, the eastern sky shifting from black to gray as the stars faded. Carlo passed through the gate, walked up the stone path to the house, and saw Celeste sitting on the front steps. She had been there for some time, knees drawn up, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, one for herself and one for him, as if she knew the exact moment he would return. She did not ask where he had gone, did not ask what happened to Trent, did not ask anything at all. She simply handed him the coffee when he sat beside her on the steps, and Carlo took it, the warmth of the porcelain spreading into his cold palm after the long night. They sat there together on the steps of the Ferretti estate in silence, watching the sky turn from gray to pink to orange, watching the sun rise over the Pacific below the hill, and neither spoke until the coffee was gone and the first morning light reached Bianca's rose garden. Celeste did not ask and did not judge. She simply stayed. And for Carlo, a man whose entire life had been surrounded by people who either feared him or wanted something from him, the presence of someone who simply stayed without asking for anything was more valuable than anything he had ever been able to buy. Helen came to the estate 3 days after the attack without calling or warning, driving from Santa Monica up to Malibu at 8 in the morning with the eyes of a woman who hadn't slept for several nights. Franco had told her everything over the phone the morning after the attack because Carlo told him to call. And since then, Helen had lain awake in the empty Santa Monica house, turning over a single thought again and again. When the gunshots rang out in the house where her granddaughter slept, Celeste didn't run. She could have run. She had almost run before, plastic bag in hand at the back door at 2 in the morning. And if she had run that night, no one could have blamed her because she wasn't blood, wasn't family, owed that child nothing beyond barely more than a month of affection. But she didn't run. She grabbed Gemma, ran to the safe room, held her granddaughter against a scarred and fragile chest, and sang the song her daughter used to sing. Helen thought about that until her eyes burned and filled and dried and filled again, and on the third morning she drove to Malibu. Celeste was sitting on the back terrace watching Gemma draw in the rose garden when she heard familiar heels behind her and turned to see Helen, and this time something was different. Helen's back was still straight and her chin still high, but her eyes were no longer sharp. They were red and tired, and carried something Celeste had never seen in this woman before: vulnerability. Helen sat down beside her, not across from her as always, but close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and she was silent for a long time watching Gemma color a flower in the sun before she spoke, her voice soft and faintly trembling in a way Celeste never would have imagined from Helen Whitfield. Bianca chose the right person. Celeste turned to her, and Helen continued, "I'm sorry, Celeste. I'm sorry I doubted you. Sorry for what I said on this very terrace. I'm a mother who lost her child, and I turned my pain into a weapon aimed at someone who didn't deserve it." Celeste didn't speak. Tears fell before she could stop them. And then Helen did something she hadn't done with anyone except Bianca and Gemma since her daughter died. She reached out and embraced Celeste. The hug wasn't easy or warm in a natural way. It was stiff and awkward because Helen wasn't used to holding strangers. But it was real, and Celeste felt the weight of everything Helen was letting go of inside it. Suspicion, fear, control, all dissolving between two women sitting on a terrace overlooking the rose garden of the woman they both loved. When they pulled apart, their eyes were wet, and Helen began to tell stories she hadn't told anyone since the funeral because it hurt too much. Bianca at 5 sneaking into the garden at midnight to count stars because she believed each one was a wish waiting to be claimed. Bianca at 10 bringing home an injured stray cat and crying for 3 days when Helen said they couldn't keep it until Helen gave in because no one ever won against Bianca's tears. Bianca at 15 planting her first rose bush in the Boston garden and watering it with orange juice because she'd read vitamin C was good for plants. The bush dying, Bianca crying, then planting again and this time using plain water. Celeste listened and answered with her own half of the story. Bianca at 18, planting lavender on the Stanford dorm window ledge. Bianca at 19, staying up all night with her when she was homesick. Bianca at 20, telling her Malibu was the most beautiful place in the world, and that one day they'd sit there together watching the sea. 2 women on a Malibu terrace pieced Bianca's life together, Helen holding the first half and Celeste the second. And when the picture was complete, Bianca lived again between them, whole and radiant, the girl who counted stars and planted flowers and sang the wrong words and loved so fiercely that even death couldn't stop that love from reaching the right people at the right time. That afternoon, Helen went into the Ferretti kitchen and did something she'd never done with anyone except Bianca. She taught Celeste how to make clam chowder using the Whitfield family recipe passed from grandmother to mother to daughter and now to Celeste. This wasn't a cooking lesson, and Celeste understood that when Helen placed the apron in her hands, it was a symbol, a gate opening, an unspoken declaration that you belong to this family now. Gemma sat on the counter watching them cook together and smiled. "Grandma, are you teaching Miss Star great-grandma's recipe?" Helen nodded, her eyes wet again, but this time with a different kind of tears. Celeste enrolled in the accelerated BSN program at UCLA 2 months after the attack, when the scar on her wrist had faded by a shade and her eyes were 2 shades brighter than the day she stood on a Malibu street corner in torn clothes. The program lasted 14 months, designed for students with a science background, and Celeste's Stanford Pre-Med Foundation allowed her to bypass nearly a third of the coursework. Every morning she drove the car Carlo taught her to drive down to Westwood, studied all day, then made it back by 5 in the evening to pick Gemma up from preschool and begin the evening care routine. During those 14 months, Celeste grew thinner from lack of sleep, but her eyes shone brighter than ever because, for the first time in years, she was building something of her own instead of merely surviving. Carlo watched her study at the kitchen table at midnight. Books and flashcards spread across the surface, a cold cup of coffee beside her, and sometimes he sat across from her doing his own work in silence, the two of them awake late at the same table without needing to speak. When Celeste graduated, Gemma and Helen sat in the front row of the ceremony, Gemma clapping the loudest in the hall, and Carlo stood in the very back with Franco, a Mafia boss at a nursing graduation with 2 guards outside the door. But he was there, and that was the first thing Celeste saw when she turned toward the audience. 3 months later, Celeste opened Bianca's Light in a 2-story building in Koreatown, Los Angeles, supporting women and children affected by domestic abuse. Funding came from the legitimate Ferretti Foundation Carlo had established before Bianca died. Completely clean money with transparent audits, because Bianca had once asked him to keep at least part of the empire entirely in the light, and he had kept that promise. Celeste designed the center around her own experience. Secure counseling rooms, a hotline, temporary housing for mothers and children, free legal support for victims needing restraining orders, and a small corner on the 2nd floor, where children could draw and send messages to anyone they missed through a night sky painted on the wall. On opening night, the center was packed. Lawyers, social workers, volunteers, representatives from nonprofit organizations. Helen stood by the reception table, greeting guests with the Boston Society grace she carried everywhere. Franco stood by the door because guarding doors was what he knew. And Gemma, now nearly 6, ran around telling everyone that Miss Starr had opened this house to help sad people stop being sad. Carlo stood in the back corner of the room, black suit, black tie, a drink in his hand that he didn't touch, his eyes fixed on one person. Celeste stood at the microphone to speak, wearing a simple navy blue dress. Helen helped her choose, hair falling to her shoulders, her voice steady in a way it hadn't been the day she first spoke to Carlo in the Malibu restaurant. She spoke about the center, about its mission, about the woman it was named for. She said Bianca taught her that love doesn't end with death, but keeps flowing through those still alive if they dare to open themselves to it, and that this center was proof of that truth. Carlo listened from the corner, and his chest ached, not with grief, but with something swelling inside his ribs, demanding release, something he had buried for 18 months beneath ice, beneath Bianca's wedding ring, beneath the shadow of the empire. And tonight, watching Celeste stand under the lights, speaking with the strength of someone who had walked through hell and chosen to return to help others escape, that thing cracked through the ice, and he couldn't stop it anymore. The event ended close to 11 at night. Guests left. Helen took Gemma home to sleep because it was late. Franco drove the cleanup staff, and Carlo drove Celeste back to the estate in silence. When the car passed through the gate, Celeste didn't go inside but walked straight to the rose garden behind the house, where Bianca had planted hundreds of rose bushes along the hillside. Carlo followed her without asking why, and they stopped at the stone bench beside the peace rose bush where they had spent so many sleepless nights. The Malibu sky was clear that night, stars bright against the dark, the sea breeze light with the scent of roses and salt. Carlo stood beside Celeste, both of them looking up. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured as if weighing every word because once spoken they couldn't be taken back. "Bianca sent you to save Gemma," he said. "But I think you saved me too." Celeste turned to him, her eyes catching starlight, and she replied softly, "You saved me first, Carlo. You saved me first." Silence stretched between them, the wind carrying rose scent around them, and Carlo lifted his hand slowly, centimeter by centimeter, as if giving her time to step back if she wished, his fingers stopping a breath from her cheek, and his eyes asking. Celeste didn't step back. She leaned into his palm and closed her eyes, and Carlo touched her cheek, the first time he touched her not to keep her standing when she wanted to collapse, but simply because he wanted to, because he needed to, because 18 months without touching anyone had turned his skin into a desert, and now she was rain. Their first kiss was so slow it almost didn't happen, his lips brushing hers like a falling petal, both of them trembling, both carrying scars of loss and violence and the fear of unworthiness. But both of them here, in Bianca's rose garden, under the star-filled sky, where Gemma sent messages to her mother every night. And that kiss didn't erase the pain, but it said the pain wasn't the final story. Jonah Mercer came to Bianca's light 3 months after opening night, a 34-year-old veteran who served 2 tours in Afghanistan, discharged after a shoulder injury, now a freelance carpenter who spent 3 afternoons a week volunteering at community support centers around Los Angeles. He was tall, solid, but gentle, with an easy smile and a warm, low voice that never rose, his hands always busy fixing something because he believed anything broken could be repaired with enough patience. He came with his daughter Zoe, 5 years old, brown hair in 2 braids, her mother killed in a car accident 2 years earlier. And on that very first afternoon, Zoe ran to the drawing corner where Gemma was sitting. The 2 girls looked at each other for 3 seconds, then smiled, then drew one picture together with 2 stars and a moon, and from that day on they were inseparable. Jonah began fixing everything that was broken in the center. Jammed doors, leaking faucets, wobbly shelves, doing it all with a smile and asking for nothing. Celeste noticed he started looking at her differently around the 4th week, his gaze lingering longer than necessary when she spoke, his hand brushing hers when he passed her coffee and not pulling back right away, and she knew because she had lived long enough to tell the difference between kindness and interest with intent. Jonah was everything Carlo wasn't. Safe, ordinary, legitimate. He earned his living with his hands and slept well every night because there was no blood on his conscience. He took Zoe to the park on Sunday afternoons and didn't need guards following him. He was the life Celeste once dreamed of before Trent happened. The life the Stanford pre-med part of her still longed for, peaceful and clean, and with no one dying because of anyone's orders. Celeste wavered, and she hated herself for it. She told Helen one afternoon while cooking in the estate kitchen, her voice low, as if afraid Carlo might hear even though he was in the basement meeting with Franco. "There's someone at the center," she said. "He's good, safe, normal, and I don't know what to do with how that feels." Helen set the knife down on the cutting board and looked at her without judgment, asking only one question. Because of him, or because of Carlo? Celeste couldn't answer, and that was the answer. Carlo knew about Jonah because Carlo knew everything. Franco reported it not out of jealousy for his boss, but because it was his job to know who came close to the family. Carlo didn't respond with violent jealousy, didn't order Jonah threatened, didn't do any of the things his Mafia instincts urged him to do. Instead, he called Celeste into the living room one evening after Gemma was asleep and spoke plainly in the way only Carlo could, calm and painful at the same time. "I know about Jonah Mercer," he said, holding a glass of whiskey he didn't drink. Eyes on the dark ocean beyond the glass doors. "I'm not a good man, Celeste. I've never been safe. I can't give you a normal life because my life isn't normal, and never will be. And if a normal life is what you need, then I won't stand in your way." His voice wasn't cold, but his eyes didn't look at her. They looked out to sea, and Celeste saw his hand tighten around the glass until his knuckles went white, the only way Carlo Ferretti ever let pain show. Celeste opened her mouth to speak, but small footsteps on the stairs cut her off. Gemma stood at the bottom step, eyes half closed with sleep, her biscuit bear tucked under one arm, clearly having heard part of the conversation even if she didn't understand all of it. She walked straight to Celeste, climbed onto the sofa into her lap, then looked up at her with sleepy blue eyes that were serious beyond her years. "Miss Starr," she said, "Daddy Jonah is fun and Zoe is fun too. But Daddy Carlo needs you more. Daddy Carlo doesn't smile when you're not home, and Daddy Carlo stands outside my door every night listening when I tell the Star stories. He thinks I don't know, but I know." Celeste held Gemma tighter, her throat closing. Then Gemma added softly, like a breath, "Mommy told me in my dream that the person who needs you the most is the one you should stay with." Carlo stood by the window with his back to them, his shoulders rigid, and Celeste saw him swallow once, then again. She set Gemma down and told her to go to bed, then stood and walked toward Carlo. He didn't turn, and she spoke to his back, her voice steady and clear and not shaking. "I don't need safe, Carlo. I lived safe with Trent when he locked me inside 4 walls and called it protection. I don't need normal because normal doesn't exist for people like me and people like you. I need you." Carlo turned, and for the first time, Celeste saw his face with nothing hidden. No ice, no walls, no Mafia boss. Just a 37-year-old man who had lost his wife and was terrified of losing someone else. fear and hope bare on his face in a way she knew he never let anyone else see. "If you choose me," he said quietly, "you choose everything. The darkness, the danger, the enemies. I can't promise tomorrow." Celeste stepped closer, placed her hand over his chest where his heart beat, and said, "Bianca couldn't promise tomorrow either, but she still chose you, and now I do too." That night, after Gemma had gone to bed, Carlo led Celeste into his study, opened the drawer, took out the inlaid wooden box, and pulled out the fifth envelope, the one he had kept for months waiting for this exact moment. The envelope bearing Bianca's familiar right-slanted rounded handwriting that read for Celeste when she comes home. He placed it in her hands and said, "This is for you. Bianca wrote it for you." Then he stepped out of the room so she could read it alone, because he knew some conversations belonged only to two people, even when one of them was no longer here. Celeste opened the envelope with lightly trembling hands and read. Bianca wrote that if Celeste was reading this letter, then she had found her way back, and that meant every prayer Bianca had whispered had been heard. Bianca wrote that she knew Celeste, knew her heart was always big enough to hold more than one love at the same time, knew she was afraid she didn't deserve happiness. But Celeste, you do, you always have. Don't be afraid of new love, because new love doesn't erase the old. It only adds another star to the sky. Bianca wrote, "Love Carlo for me too. Love Gemma as your own child. Live happily not because I ask you to, but because you deserve every good thing in this world. Forever in your heart, Bianca." Celeste finished reading and folded the letter, pressing it to her chest. Her eyes closed as tears slid down her face. But these were different tears, the tears of someone who had been given permission to keep living, to be happy, by the very person she was afraid she was betraying. 1 year later, the wedding took place in Bianca's rose garden on a June afternoon. There was no spectacle, no extravagance, only the people who mattered most. Helen sat in the front row in a pale cream dress, her eyes wet but her lips smiling. Franco stood beside Carlo as best man, wearing a suit for the first time without a weapon hidden inside, because today he didn't need one. Jonah and Zoe sat in the third row, because Jonah had become a close friend of the family, and 3 months earlier he had started dating a volunteer teacher from Bianca's light, the ordinary life he deserved. Gemma, now nearly 7, walked down the aisle, scattering rose petals cut into star shapes that she and Helen had sat up all night preparing. Star petals falling onto the ground among the hundreds of rose bushes Bianca had planted, and everyone felt that she was there, among the flowers, in the breeze, in the smile of her daughter. The following morning, the family gathered at Bianca's light for the opening of the Bianca Thompson Ferretti Memorial Garden in the center's backyard. The garden was small but beautiful, roses lining the edges, a low fountain at the center, and a bronze plaque engraved with a sentence Bianca had once written in her journal that Helen found after her daughter passed away. "Love multiplies when it is shared." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "In memory of Bianca Thompson Ferretti, who taught us that family is built by choice, nurtured by love, and guided by stars." Gemma stepped forward before the crowd, small among adults, but her clear voice carried through the garden. "My mom knows the best family is the one you build yourself," she said. "She helped us find each other, and now we help other families find their way home." Zoe stood beside her, holding her hand, and added softly, "And sometimes if you're lucky you get extra sisters and grandparents and uncles and lots of people who love you." As night fell, the garden lit up with hundreds of small star-shaped lights that Celeste and the volunteers had hung throughout the space. Warm golden light shimmering among the rose bushes, forming a constellation on the ground. Carlo stood beside Celeste, his fingers intertwined with hers, Franco behind them, Helen and Jonah and Zoe completing the circle, and Gemma lifted her face to the sky where the first star of the night had appeared, bright and steady. "That's Mom," she whispered, and everyone heard it in the stillness of the garden. "She's still helping people find their way home." The sea breeze moved through the small garden carrying the sweet, warm scent of roses, the scent Carlo knew was Bianca, and in that moment everyone felt it, gentle as a smile from the other side, a silent blessing for the next chapter in a love story that kept expanding. This story teaches us that loss isn't the end, but the beginning of another journey, that true love doesn't stop at death but continues to flow through the living if they're brave enough to open their hearts, that family isn't something we're born into, but something we choose to build through sacrifice, forgiveness, and trust. No matter what darkness life places you in, there is always light waiting ahead if you're willing to keep walking. If this story touched your heart, please like and share this video with someone you love. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more moving stories each day. We'd love to know how you felt about this story. Did it make you think of someone in your own life? Was there a moment that made you cry or smile? Please write in the comments below so we can listen to the deepest emotions from your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye and see you in the next video.